Edcouch is in eastern Hidalgo County. Elsa is one of its neighboring cities. As of the census of 2000, there were 3,342 people living there. Hispanic or Latino people of any race make 97.13% of the population. Many might have not heard about the Edcouch-Elsa walkout that happened in 1968, but it was a tough time for Mexican Americans. They were brave enough to stand up and fight for their rights to an equal education. There were many demands to the administrations from the student body. The students did not have a say on anything in reality. They had to follow every single rule, even if it was unfair, and if the rule was to be broken by any Anglo student, the teachers and principal would not punish them as they would to a Mexican American student. They would even get punished if they were to speak their native language.
My name is Francisco Guajardo. I'm a professor in the Department of Organization and School Leadership. And I was raised in Elsa. And Elsa, of course, is one of the twin towns with Edcouch that make up the Edcouch-Elsa School District. The Edcouch-Elsa High School walkout of 1968 is a very historic event in the history of the civil rights movement of Mexican-American Chicano civil rights. It occurred on the 14th day of November of 1968. And when it happened, it really involved a whole community. There were more than 140 students who actually physically walked out of school on that fateful day. It was also a lot of parents who were in the know. It was also a lot of students who, for whatever reason, chose to not participate or maybe did participate in other ways. There was a whole contingent of outside people who came in and were supportive. There were also people who were against it. People in administration at the school district were against it. A number of parents were also against it. The power structure, as it were, was largely against the student walkout. The student walkout actually gained some traction locally, but in terms of a macro picture, the student walkout of Edcouch-Elsa High School really was catapulted to prominence because of a 1968, late November 1968 news report on the CBS Evening News that was hosted by Walter Cronkite. The CBS network sent a reporter to the border to do a report on the walkout. That reporter then filed a report, and on this one day in mid to late November, when Walter Cronkite introduced the story, that had a very, very deep impact in terms of legitimizing the walkout, legitimizing the story, and really elevating it into a macro level of attention. Walter Cronkite's voice, even though Walter Cronkite did not narrate the story, Walter Cronkite actually introduced it. And at that time, and even to this day, Walter Cronkite's voice, Walter Cronkite's personality, Walter Cronkite's character and persona, are almost like equal to the voice of America. And so when Walter Cronkite introduced the story, I think that it had a great symbolic impact on the country and specifically on the meaning of the Edcouch-Elsa High School walkout, what the students did, what the community went through, and really as an important event in the history of not only South Texas, but of the civil rights movement and the Chicano movement. So I really do believe that Walter Cronkite, the man who announced the man on the moon, Walter Cronkite, the man who wept with America when he announced that John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, had been assassinated. Walter Cronkite, the voice of America, also introduced the story of the Edcouch-Elsa High School walkout. And so his voice, I think, lends credence, legitimacy, and I think authenticity to this event.
Armando Peña was one of the students who participated in the walkout. He remembers that day, and this is what he wrote. It escalated into that essentially over 1 to 2 weeks, and then eventually by the 14th of November 1968, that was the day that we decided that we had to make our case known by going on a walkout. We decided those who identified with what we were doing would not attend classes that day, and were actually gathering in front of the school. Basically, we would walk around. We didn't start out with any signs right away, but then after the first day, we'd come home and we started planning the idea of making signs. And I still remember the sign that me and one of my friends made. And I remember the slogans on it. The sign had said, "Students for a better education." And that's the one that we carried. Then there were these threats to expel students, and I think as a result of the threats, I think 2/3 of the parents gave in, and the administration didn't give an inch into the demands, and then demanded that if the parents wanted their sons and daughters back into the school, they have to attend a series of hearings to hear from each individual parent and their children why they had walked out. Essentially, it was an excuse to get them to apologize. I remember participating in that, and I remember going up in this hearing and going in and them asking us why we had walked out, and we told them why. And then they asked us if we had any regrets and if we were sorry, and we said no. And that was the end of that. And basically they said, "You are free to go." They couldn't accept us, and that was it. I remember that other parents were going in there and they were telling their kids, "You better apologize and you better go in there and tell them what they want to hear," and that kind of things. And some parents, they would be crying, and 2 students were crying. I remember a parent slapping a student when we were out front and we were still walking around because the mother was trying to drag her daughter out of the group and bring her back into school. My mother was basically the opposite. She basically was bringing us boxes of sandwiches and soda that she and some of her friends were making for the boycotting students.
Rights protest by Mexican-American students in Edcouch, Texas has spread to 2 other locations in the Rio Grande Valley. The story of that movement from Ed Rabel.
This is the Rio Grande, which flows the length of the Rio Grande Valley. It is a lush valley of citrus groves, where Mexican-Americans, attracted by the agriculture industry, outnumber the Anglo population. The practice here has been one of domination, the Anglos dominating the Latins. But the Mexican-Americans say that day has ended, that they are on the move, that they will have a piece of the action. Mexican-American students at a school in the valley community of Edcouch have been demonstrating for what they say are their rights. The school district expelled about 175 of the students after they staged a walkout and began the demonstrations. Later, the students presented a list of demands, one of which challenged the school's alleged policy prohibiting the speaking of Spanish on the school grounds. Why is it very important to you that you be allowed to speak Spanish on the school grounds?
Well, that's our mother tongue, so I don't see why it should be taken away from us.
We're born of Mexican-American parents, and we have to speak Spanish to them, and they want us to forget our native tongue. I don't think that's fair for us.
School officials deny charges that speaking Spanish on school grounds is prohibited, although they say they strongly encourage pupils to speak English. They also deny charges that Mexican-American students have been physically abused. At a special meeting between board members and parents, School Superintendent A.W. Bell denied the allegation that faculty members have been guilty of blatant discrimination against pupils.
I can give you the official demand of both the school board and the administration, and that is that we not have discrimination in the school system. There may be isolated cases of discrimination that we don't know about. And I say quite frankly, if we do have them, I'd like to know about them, because we're not supposed to have them.
Well, what is the attitude of the administration toward Mexican Americans?
Well, they, on my opinion, they have always been pushing us, and I think it's time for us not to be pushed around so much like they have.
They want you to say, well, I regret what I've done, and I won't do it again. They want you to do that in order to get back into school. Will you do that?
No, I won't.
Why?
Because, well, I don't feel sorry for what I did. I think it's right.
The school dispute exemplifies the new spirit pervading Mexican Americans who live along this river. The Mexican Americans here hope their new spirit will bring a better life to them. Ed Rabel, CBS News, in the Rio Grande Valley.
A federal judge has ruled those school suspensions invalid, pending individual hearings for each student.